Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to episode 47 of the Cloudcast. We're coming to you again live from our massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. And riding shotgun tonight is longtime friend of the show, Nick Weaver. Nick, welcome aboard.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So before we get started with our guests tonight, and this is kind of a big show, give us the latest on the last time we talked. You were working on Project Razor. What's the latest on Razor?
Oh, wow. So the latest news on Razor is the reception has been pretty good so far. We were about a little over 90 days out from the public open sourcing. We just, this week, actually open sourced the microkernel, which is the in-memory client we use for discovery.
Cool. Very good. So it's getting
100% it's open source, yeah.
Excellent. So the whole thing's open source. It's getting traction on Git. You got people pulling it and making changes to it, and
we got one. If I can say one case that's actually kind of cool is we got some attention from CERN, the guys that run the Large Hadron Collider, the Higgs boson discovery guys. They are actually huge Puppet Labs customers, and they've expressed some interest in actually using Razor for all of their hundreds of thousands of nodes deployment. So that's spinning up pretty soon here, and that's kind of cool.
Very, very cool. Well, listen, Nick. A couple of months back, we were talking to Ivan Pekelnik. We were talking about new networks and SDNs, and still a lot of questions from the networking crowd, the sort of traditional and pushing the envelope networking crowd. So we thought we'd dive into software-defined networks, or SDNs, a lot more this week with our guest. So we're happy to have this week Kyle Forster, one of the co-founders of Big Switch Networks. So Kyle, welcome aboard.
Oh, thanks, Brian.
So Kyle, tell us a little bit about yourself. You've got a pretty interesting background, and then give us a quick introduction for anybody that doesn't know Big Switch Networks. Who are you guys? What are you trying to do?
Yeah, sure. So with my own background, I came to Big Switch. I actually spent most of my career over at Cisco.
Okay.
Went to a small startup with a crew of Cisco folks. When I was moving back to the Bay Area, my co-founder Guido Appenzeller and I went out for lunch. The two of us had been friends since back in grad school days. We actually had offices right next to each other.
Okay.
We had stayed in touch ever since. And he started talking about the research that his team at Stanford was doing, and I kept thinking back on all these intractable problems that we were trying to solve as I was leaving Cisco. And it was like a light went off. I mean, I've got to say, I went back from the lunch. I downloaded all the research that he and the team had written over the last couple of years. I downloaded the open source over the weekend and started playing around with it. A couple months later, there were a few of us huddled in the back of a VC's office on Sand Hill Road.
Okay, and that was the work that was the what do they call it, the Clean Labs project over at Stanford, that was looking at things like OpenFlow and things like that, correct?
Yeah, the Clean Slate Lab it was called. That was the lab at Stanford that Guido led that incubated OpenFlow.
Okay, well, very cool. So so you've been on sort of both sides of the fence. The big vendor that had kind of the traditional evolution of architecture, you got to see what went on over there, how they acquired, how they scaled and solved problems, and now you're coming at it from a much different perspective, very software-centric perspective, obviously. So let's sort of dive into SDN a little bit. You'd have to have been under a rock this week to not hear some of the news that was going on around SDN in the market. Obviously, one of your competitors got acquired by VMware this week for a very large sum of money. But before we go into that and sort of make this all about valuations and things like that, let's talk about Big Switch's view on SDN. I mean, there's a lot of different definitions and viewpoints, and is it about a protocol? Is it about tunneling? Is it about where should it start? Where should what's Big Switch's take on SDN and architecture and those types of things?
Sure. I think the first thing that I go back to is to say SDN itself is really a broad umbrella term without a tight technical definition. Now, there are all kinds of new things that are going on in the data center, new ways of building networking equipment that are much more tightly technically defined that fit underneath that umbrella. But I'd say SDN itself, even as a broad term, I think it's still useful because to me it represents a movement that, I guess, a technical philosophy around separation of the control in the data plane.
Yep.
which is a really interesting technical sort of philosophical way of, hey, here's a different way of building networking devices, and that'll lead us into a different way of building networks.
Okay.
This kind of technical philosophy aspect to it.
Right.
At the same time, to me, it's kind of the reason that this has so much legs is because, frankly, if you look at the folks who have been involved in pushing, in my mind, the major technical pillars of SDN, if you look at the open networking, originally the Stanford team, but then the Open Networking Foundation that was pushing OpenFlow, it's fundamentally being driven by people who design and operate very large data centers.
Okay.
And that's a big deal because it's basically a group of people who have deep operational experience saying the current networking technologies for us are so far from adequate that this isn't going to take an evolution, this is going to take a revolution. And so, SDN becomes branded as, hey, there's this really bad need to think about revolutionary new ways of building networks. And at the same time, there's kind of this technical philosophy on, hey, we have this general direction for how to build new networking equipment.
Okay. So obviously the ONF, the Open Network Foundation that you were talking about is your teams are part of it as a contributor and part of the forums and the discussions that are going on, but it's also folks like Google and some of the largest service providers, Yahoo and others. So at what point does SDN, obviously for them, they've got different types of problems than, say, even the largest enterprises have in terms of, how they have to operate, the way they try and, associate cost with revenue or associate cost with business challenges. Is this a set of technologies that's really mostly for a segment of the market, or does it have applicability to a broader market segment for things maybe that aren't super web scale, huge data centers?
It's a great question. I think I'd add, the founding members were all the hyperscale types, but a whole series of enterprises have been increasingly active in Open Networking Foundation. I think Goldman Sachs actually just joined a couple months ago.
Okay.
And I think they're the first of several. If you look at just the evolutionary path of the technology, I'd say 3-4 years ago, this was something that was really being driven by academic research. Mm-hmm. And in those really early days, some of the hyperscale crew wound up getting involved. I joined on when the OpenFlow standards body was 16 people, give or take, and it was kind of whoever could find parking outside the computer science building at Stanford.
Okay.
Like if you couldn't find parking, then you probably sat out that day and went to lunch instead.
Right.
Yeah. So it's kind of an academic thing to begin with, but then about 3 years ago was when a team from Google started sitting in on the standards meetings, and that changed the tenor a little bit. I think a number of folks kind of perked up at that point.
Sure.
Suddenly was this, they had an intractable problem to solve. How do you do a million MAC address Hadoop job? It blows out every networking device under the sun. So, from that one specific problem, though, it got the attention of a handful of other hyperscale data-centered folks who were looking at, if not that million MAC address Hadoop job problem, similar problems or interesting problems with large-scale infrastructure as a service.
The Big Ben problem.
Ben problem. I mean, if you kind of, so 3 years ago it was sort of the massive scale infrastructure as a service. Then 2 years ago it started being driven a little bit more by much more enterprise needs.
Okay.
And at this point now, this year is when the fruition, I think, of a lot of that standards work that was being done is now coming to market.
Okay.
So it's a straight evolution path. At this point, this is very much more an enterprise technology.
Okay. So you are seeing people that are coming to you. I've heard from various groups that maybe are still in kind of traditional network operations. They're kind of saying, I don't know what all the use cases are, but what you're seeing from talking to your early beta customers, from talking to folks that are coming to the ONF, they've got very sort of distinct sets of problems. Are they more about kind of speed that they want to solve problems? Are they really about kind of new ways of routing and doing kind of core networking things? What's the essence of the types of problems that you're starting to see evolve out of this, beyond the million MAC Hadoop problem?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'd say there's sort of one cluster of problems that I'll put in one big bucket and I'll just call it network virtualization.
Okay.
And so we see a ton of interest around there. But then there's also this big long tail of problems where, hey, it's really easy to draw on a whiteboard what a package should do, but really, really, really hard to get today's networking equipment to do it.
Okay.
And we've all been part of a design where we just designed ourselves into a hole for one reason or another. So I think what we're seeing today is the emergence of, certainly on our side, certainly acquisition that just happened, a ton of interest in using SDN for network virtualization. Mm-hmm. A lot of it is for infrastructure as a service type builds.
Right.
Just because today's networking equipment just doesn't stand up to infrastructure as a service requirements. But I think over time we'll start to, I think to me that's the first application of many. It's the first real beachhead, but then there's a whole series of long tail apps. And in that long tail, my guess is that there's going to be another major app in there that we'll see sometime in the next 24 months.
If I could add a question, where do you see the gap on the infrastructure as a service from present state, kind of your choices and the different interactions, and kind of where SDN's at now and where it's going? And I'm thinking more of like the difference between the public cloud with the hyperscale cloud guys, but no more like the private cloud guys, right? The OpenStack deployments for like Goldman or for someone else. What are the infrastructure as a service gaps that SDN helps to solve?
So if you look at if you were trying to design a data center network to me 5 years ago, you would probably assume somewhere around 30 servers, give or take, in a rack, right? Around 30 MAC addresses that you have running up and down. If we look at a virtualized rack today in an enterprise, at least all the customers that I'm dealing with generally are running somewhere 200 to 250 VMs per rack. Right, so that's a factor of 10 increase in 5 years in the number of MAC addresses. And if we just look next year, a huge number of the folks that I'm dealing with are trying to figure out ways to get up to 2,000 VMs per rack. So now the needs that you have at the top of rack switch starts to look an awful lot more like an aggregation switch. And the V switches and all these chassis start to look a whole lot more like edge switches.
So do you see the proprietary stuff that, and being that I work for EMC, and I'm going to open the basket a bit here, but do you see the proprietary stuff that VMware's done over the last 6-7 years with V switches and distributed virtual switches and the plugins to the 1000V? Where do you see that changing with SDN? How do you see SDN affecting stuff like that with competition from OpenStack and Eucalyptus and CloudStack?
Sure. I think that you can go really far if you control the vSwitch alone, but I don't think that you can go all the way to what most enterprises need.
Interesting.
If you're just doing networking, touching the vSwitch, fascinating things you can do. Don't get me wrong. Look, there are really, really interesting things that you can do there. But it doesn't really help you with your storage problems. It doesn't really help you with any bare metal hosts that you want to put in. It doesn't really help you with any L4 to L7 services that are being done in hardware that need to get inserted into a virtual network. So it kind of comes with a lot of limitations. And the other piece is there's kind of this ugly performance, boogie monster sitting down below, and you've got to figure that out somehow by reusing elements of the physical network. In the same way VXLAN reuses multicast in the physical network in order to overcome performance issues with broadcast. There are a whole series of those that show up. It's my belief, stepping back for a second, it's my belief that the reason why SDN is really important is because it's the first time there's a real cohesive framework here that lets us control both hypervisor switches and physical switches at the same time.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah, very cool.
So is it, so as you're explaining this to people, as you're talking to, network architecture teams, is that you made an analogy just a second ago where you sort of said the hypervisor switch is sort of becoming the new access switch, the top of rack switch is really sort of becoming the new distribution switch, and there's always been debates, should there be 2 tiers or 3 tiers and so forth. The distribution switches, at least in the sort of traditional model, were always really kind of the big workhorses in terms of being able to be kind of the first place to really apply intelligence, the first place to do partitioning and traffic steering and rate limiting and so forth. I mean, is that kind of an analogy sometimes you have to use as you're talking to customers, or do you sort of have to say, let's erase everything that's on the board today, because if we keep using those old analogies, you're not really going to see where the ability of these new technologies can go. What's the conversation look like that you have with your customers?
Sure. I think we're big fans. The SDN camps kind of split real fast into folks who say, hey, look, this is so revolutionary, we need to create an entirely new set of abstractions, an entirely new way of thinking about the network. And I think we're in a little bit more of the second camp that says, yeah, this is a revolutionary way of building networks underneath, but hey, how can we get there using the tools that we've got using tools that people are very comfortable with today, so that it's not kind of a, hey, one day the whole world just changed on us.
Mm-hmm.
I
Okay.
think I think following your analogy, I always think of the some of the golden design rules of being, hey, do a lot of my policy at the edge, do my traffic engineering at the ag and core. Kind of always sort of come back to that set of rules. I think that set of rules very much still applies. Just where the edge is has changed a little bit.
Okay.
I got a question. So for a lot of network guys, I mean, it's not I wouldn't say it's a massive hurdle to kind of understand the new way of doing things, but how do you see the vehicle to that for everybody outside of the hyperscale, like your enterprise customers, your hardcore old school network dudes? How do they educate themselves? What's the vehicle for that? Is it the big companies, the Ciscos and the Junipers, that eventually bring that in the enterprise, or is it going to be more of this new scale commoditization, kind of like how Linux works, right? It's open, everybody can learn, there's teams and projects and groups you can go to. I mean, what's the vehicle to the enterprise to change that mindset?
So I think there are three things here that, to me, are going to make this that are going to really accelerate the uptake here. Just bring the world up the learning curve. I think the first is that in and around SDN, there's a lot more open source than there is around traditional networking. I mean, we even launched a big hunk of our controller. We open sourced it as Project Floodlight. You download it, actually comes with a full network simulator, so that you can actually get a network up and running. I mean, on my Mac, I can simulate somewhere around 30 switches and about 50, 60 hosts, something like that.
Yeah, I've actually I downloaded and played with it a little bit. It's actually pretty awesome. I will give you props for that.
Thanks a ton. Yeah. Something like that just means, hey, look, it's a web download, right? So you can get a simulator up and running with actually a full-fledged controller instead of having to go out and drop, I don't know how many tens of thousands of dollars kitting out a lab. So that's just, we've had 6,000 downloads of Floodlight, right? Learning curve is accelerated that way. The other thing is SDN, sure, they're the big apps that go smack in the middle of mission-critical infrastructure as a service builds, but already we're starting to see take-up of smaller apps, things that do offline functions like network tapping. One of my colleagues, patch panel. You can turn a 10 gig switch into a patch panel that's controlled by an iPhone. There are a lot of really useful tools. Just not sexy, but just really, really useful small tools here, as well as some of the really big apps.
Okay. Now, so you've talked about Floodlights. Basically, like you said, you took a chunk of what you guys are going to probably eventually turn into your commercial version of the big switch controller, but you got it out there early. You opened it to the open source community, and I've seen in some of the interviews you've given that you're seeing some very, very unique applications written on top of that. You just mentioned a couple of them. What's who are those SDN developers today? Are they versus, say, the SDN operators? Are they a lot of the same people? Is the SDN developer base more the folks that were doing Nagios kind of things or other stuff like that? What's that community look like?
So it is totally open source. There's no registration involved at all. So the stuff that I know comes from hanging out in the forums, comes from sort of the casual meetups, comes from sort of the casual spots where we're speaking, and a lot of people come up and talk about Floodlight. So let me just say, this is far from a scientific study here.
Yep.
But it's my sense that the community breaks down into roughly three groups. They're the folks who download it just because they want to use it, right? They don't want to write code; they just want to download something and use it. So, like, it has we just open sourced a Quantum plugin, and so you can download this thing and actually you can use this for effectively think of it like an Apple replacement for Quantum.
Okay.
Right, that's for OpenStack. There's a second community out there that, like you just said, the Nagios crew, right? Folks who have hacked on software that's in and around networking for a while. And there's actually some super cool inventions that are coming up from that part of the community. And I think that part of the community is just a fascinating group to spend time with. The third part of the community is interesting. The third part of the community are not so much networking folks, but a lot of cloud folks who find the traditional networking paradigms just a real pain in the neck when it comes to integrating them with cloud software. So That's a very interesting crew because it's fundamentally not a networking crew, but they see, hey, wow, here are a bunch of really easy-to-use REST and Java APIs, so I can get the job done in the network that otherwise I would be doing a bunch of expect scripts across CLI.
Right, yeah.
Okay. So let's, we've talked a little bit about kind of where the industry's going, and I think, for a lot of folks, there's still, you either kind of have the problem today that you're absolutely looking at it. There's some that are obviously trying to learn about it. And it's very cool that the product's there, and it's the open source version's there. You can go learn. There's a lot of very good tutorials around it. The documentation's very good. Can we talk a little bit about what's going on with Big Switch Networks itself? And I mean, you guys are still in stealth mode or semi-stealth mode. Howie writes some things on his blog. Howie Zhu, who's your VP of engineering. As you guys are trying to figure out, when to ship product, what to do, how do you figure out these days how much time to spend with the community? Because obviously, if you come out with product that people can plug into very, very quickly, that works, versus the amount of time you have to spend going out working with early customers. And I mean, how does that balance work for, like you said, a startup company, small company that's got limited resources, or a finite number of resources?
Yeah, is the answer not much sleep help?
Yeah. Well, it's unique because it's we're starting to get into these class of vendors or technology vendors that are some mix of open source and commercial, and those are very, very different business models, right? And mixing them is a very interesting approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's constantly an interesting question for us to figure out. We generally have this model of, hey, we develop code for the commercial controller,
mm-hmm.
and then we pick and choose from amongst the code that the commercial train is sort of leading, and then we pick and choose from there, and we pick and choose areas to open source.
Okay.
So a lot of the work that's actually open source is stuff that we were, was in the commercial controller even 6 months ago, even in some cases actually just a few months ago. So it's one of these things where for us it's actually it's a little bit less of an either or, and it's a little bit more of a when.
Okay.
The nice thing is that a lot of our biggest customers, the reason that they're with us is because we do have this open source core philosophy. They do see the product that we're building is, over time, more and more of the product that we're building today, even the commercial product, more and more of that goes down to the open source community. They see a vibrant open source community where we're very aggressive about accepting patches from the community.
That's good. Yeah, that's a big deal.
Some companies give our model by basically saying, "Hey, look, yeah, we're open source, but we don't actually take outside code." We try to do the exact opposite very early on.
Okay. And have you made sort of a final decision or a business model decision? Is it going to be, sort of a hybrid? You're going to always release the open source and then you'll have the commercial version, or is that still in flux? It's really the first. I mean, when we started the business, we knew we wanted to be an open source core business. We thought that would be a really important. There were two things. First of all, we thought it would be important for the business because SDN is so new. Having open source out there will help a lot of people get up to speed really quickly. Mm-hmm.
It would help drive a very, very large ecosystem. So there were kind of some very very commercial reasons why we did it.
Sure.
But there was also really big, I've got to say, this kind of company philosophy reason behind it. The founding crew was myself, but most of an awful lot of the team was coming straight out of Stanford, was coming straight out of, I'd say, kind of distinguished engineering style positions at various companies, and really came out with a very strong philosophical sort of engineering bent that this is just a better. I don't want to sound too soapboxy, but it's just such a better way to build networking equipment that I think a lot of the folks really wanted the world to see that.
Okay.
So it's kind of such a core philosophy here that we don't even really question it.
Yeah, I mean it's having I had a long background at Cisco, so when you hear it from a network company perspective, yeah, it sounds very unusual. If you were to flip that over and go talk to anybody who's been living in the sort of application or server infrastructure space for a while, I don't think anybody would disagree with you that it's the open source way of building that is the results speak for themselves. I mean, you get better code, you get better security. You tend to get people that are passionate about it, so they tend to want to write better things. They're it's all out in the open, so they're prideful about what they're building, and so no, I mean, I think it just probably sounds unusual because in the network community where it's very, very hardware centric and it's always been proprietary, it's really different. It's it's a really radical sort of model, but I applaud you guys for doing it. Especially if it's sort of core to your DNA. That's very cool.
Oh, thanks a ton. It's one of these things, a lot of people that work here, a common quote is, hey, yeah, this is a networking company, but working here, it feels a lot like working for Google in the early days.
Okay.
We actually have a former product manager from Google Labs is actually sitting about 10 feet away from me.
Okay.
It's a company culture that we tried to build, and I think that just shows up in the product.
Gotcha.
So I got a question along that line. So I don't know if you saw the Google Fiber announcement today. You probably did, being a networking guy.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I saw a couple of the write-ups.
So I'm curious. I'm curious if the SDN, how much effect that has, what Google's done internally over the last couple of years, has to do with that fiber project, from a cost standpoint.
So there've been public actually about a fair number of the details for what they've been doing around SDN across their fiber backbone. The most public presentation I think I've seen, Urs Hosla from Google gave a presentation at the last Open Networking Summit, the summit put on by the ONF, basically the big SDN summit. And he said, hey, here is what is out of the 6 OpenFlow projects that Google is working on today. Here's one of the 6. It is fully in production. It has been in production for, I think at that point, was 6 months, something like that.
That was the big WAN project?
That was the big WAN project.
Yeah.
It was pretty wild to see somebody come up and see a backbone that size that is now 100% SDN.
Now, when you're talking about stuff that's at that scale, and everything doesn't have to be a Google scale, because that tends to sort of skew a lot of the discussions. You immediately start getting into conversations about high availability, and with things, when you separate the data plane from the control plane, now you've got a different sort of way you have to look at controller HA, and obviously the databases behind there. What's the current state of the art in controller technology in terms of redundancy, high availability, and where do you see that going?
Sure. I think that the short answer is I actually think it's, maybe because most of the time that I worked at Cisco, I spent actually my whole career at Cisco working on centralized control plane products between cellular and wireless. I'm fundamentally convinced actually building an HA system with separation of control and data plane is actually easier. It's different, but it's actually easier to build an HA, a highly resilient system. If you step back from that for one sec, there's this pretty clear architecture emerging. This isn't just our architecture. I think any of us that are really close to SDN in production, you see kind of 3 tiers. You see this data plane tier of physical switches and hypervisor switches. You see this controller tier, and the controller tier tends to look more like an SDK. I mean, controllers don't come out really as finished products. They come out as developer SDKs. And then you see these networking applications on top, and it's the networking apps that are the finished end user products. And so the HA strategy, certainly ours, I think more and more controllers out there have a rich set of libraries to say, hey, here's a framework, HA framework underneath, and then it's up to the application on top to use that. So like our commercial applications, for example, use underneath the covers all of our HA libraries, but it's really up to the app writers. I've got to say though, having been through this on a bunch of products at Cisco and now going through this on products here, the development of truly high-scale, truly resilient systems is so much faster in this framework. It is night and day.
Interesting. Very interesting. So, and we're sort of getting near that time frame when I know you're very, very busy, and we're sort of hitting that time spot that this show tends to work in. I wonder if I can ask you one last question, and we'll sort of come back to the business side of this. With Nicira's recent acquisition, a big number, Cisco's investment in CME, again, a large number to begin with, another large number that could be, the market's sort of starting to set valuations, but more importantly, you've got, the data center space, the cloud space is a lot of really big. It's a big war at this point. It's a lot of big companies. It's Google, it's Microsoft, it's Amazon and Oracle, and you spent a lot of time working for Mike Volpe, so you got to see firsthand, the front lines of M&A, the thinking behind large companies. When this stuff's going on, and I'm sort of asking you to speculate a little bit, what's the kind of thinking that goes on at a large company? Let's say you're HP and you're watching this and you're going, wow, I'm in the network space, but I'm not in that space. what goes on in the M&A rooms when you're talking about a really big trend that may end up being, a couple of years to really materialize? What's their thinking in terms of, R&D investment, this kind of investment, getting left behind? I mean, what have you seen in the past, and what might you expect is the thinking going on in those guys' heads? It's kind of crazy from the position you're in now, but I'm kind of, you've seen this side of it. Obviously, you guys are strategizing about it.
I don't want to comment on any of my partners, obviously, strategy specifically, but I think when I think of a bigger company and when I think of what they do with their M&A function, just as an observer, some companies just have this strategy of saying, hey, we're going to use M&A to get ahead of the market. Hey, we have so much market intelligence because we are so big, we're in so many customers. We can predict the future much better than anybody else. So we can spot companies while they're still small and pick them up and bring them in. Mm-hmm. So that's only one philosophy. Another philosophy is to say, hey, we're going to sit back, we're going to wait, and on purpose, we're going to let all of the risk go out of the market. And as soon as this market's $100 million market, then we're going to buy our way into it, because at that point it's going to be too late for us to spin up our own engineering to catch up. And I think you just find companies that use their M&A on that entire spectrum. Some that use it to get ahead when they think the market's right around the corner, and some that use it to play a very low risk strategy. I really think it's all over the board.
And do you think, with so many more things going open source, and like you said, the speed at which the development of this is happening, do you think that radically changes the timeline that you'd expect some of the big companies to respond, or is that still pretty traditional, you think?
I think so. I think there's a big war in networking brewing, and I think it's brewing in between the hypervisor folks and the physical networking folks. And I think it's one of these. It's been going on under the covers for 2-3 years now, but the analysts that cover the areas are very different. The vocabulary that covers the areas are very, very different. And so I think a lot of the vendors didn't, the public didn't totally realize that there was increasingly a war going on between the hypervisor crew and the physical networking crew. And that war just suddenly, that Cold War just got very, very, very hot.
Yep, absolutely. It's going to be a very interesting thing to watch. And like every technology trend, there's going to be some winners. There's going to be some losers. There's going to be a lot of opportunity. Probably that's the big thing. There's a lot of opportunity for companies like yourself to really change the landscape. There's opportunities for technologists of all skill sets to sort of figure out where they're going to plan their next 3-4 years worth of work, and it's a very cool time. It's fun having worked at Cisco myself for a long time. It's cool that networking is back to being something people are talking about, and what the network can do to enable things. So Kyle, thank you very much for your time tonight. Nick, thanks for the time as well. We're out of time for this week. So Kyle, real quick, you guys are obviously going to be in the news quite a bit, but if folks want to kind of engage around what Big Switch is doing, or places where you're going to be speaking, where can they find out what's going on with you, with Big Switch, and what's going on in the SDN and OpenFlow world?
So on Twitter we're at Big Switch News. We're actively putting more and more of our upcoming events up on the website, and then we have a whole series of public email aliases that are up on the site that are easiest ways to get in touch.
Okay, very cool. And we've got links to the floodlight code and some of the other things. So, well, again, thank you so much for your time tonight. Folks, for everybody listening, you can follow us on Twitter at thecloudcast.net. You can obviously reach us on the web at thecloudcast.net, and then all the millions and zillions of social network places that you can download the show. So for Nick and Kyle, thank you so much for everybody for listening, and have a great night.